Tension on U.S. university campuses is rising after police arrested hundreds of pro-Palestinian student demonstrators. Students at dozens of colleges in the U.S. have been demonstrating against the war in Gaza. They've been calling on administrators to divest from companies that allegedly profit from Israel's war against Hamas. There was violence overnight at the University of California in Los Angeles, where pro-Israel demonstrators attacked a camp set up by pro-Palestinian students. They attempted to pull down barricades protecting the camp, and there were scuffles between the two sides. Police later moved in to separate the two groups and to stop the unrest. The university cancelled all classes on Wednesday because of the violence. And in New York City, police cleared an occupied building and arrested 300 pro-Palestinian protesters on the campus of Columbia University overnight, bringing a day-long standoff to a dramatic end. Fellow demonstrators have now taken their protest to outside New York police headquarters. Many criticised the way officers broke up what they said was a peaceful protest, saying police were rough with demonstrators. New York Mayor Eric Adams has defended the decision, saying the protests were escalated by outside figures not affiliated with the university.
There were individuals on the campus, should not have been there. There were people who are professionals, and we saw evidence of training. We saw a shift in tactics that were being used. And when you start using the intelligence that Intel was able to supply, we knew it was time to communicate directly with the school and say, you have more than a peaceful protest on your hand.
Let's join our correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez Gruber, who's in New York City, near Columbia University. Welcome, Ben. So what's the latest on this day after this police raid?
There were a group of protesters earlier today in front of this entrance that's quite close to the hall that was occupied by the students, and where NYPD, New York police, entered with a lot of law enforcement officers late evening yesterday. Now the situation is calm. The big question now, of course, will be what will happen with the students. More than 100 students were arrested. There were at Columbia University and also another university here in New York, bringing the number of arrests to 282. The big question will be now if they will face expulsion, as the university has said, and what will continue to happen. We only got one email from the presidency of Columbia University today saying that there's no media access to campus. It has made it quite difficult also to do this coverage, and they also said that Hamilton Hall that he is here right behind me is an active crime scene by NYPD, so we're still waiting for confirmation on that side.
And who was the New York Mayor Eric Adams talking about when he blamed external actors and professionals for the escalation on the Columbia campus?
That's a good question that many also students here are asking themselves, because NYPD has not released the information of how many of those who were arrested are part of the university community and how many are not part of the university community. And also what they said that had a chain during a press conference saying that it shows how professional these protesters are, but at the end it turned out that there was just a bike lock that was used and that was also promoted by a university that many students have here. So there is a lack of information there. Even the student journalists who have been covering this over the past couple of days as this has been unfolding have not been granted access. Only yesterday, essential staff and those who are living inside of campus have been able to enter, and the only response that we got also to ask if we will get an official statement or if we will be able to talk to a spokesperson of the university was not today, so we will try again tomorrow.
And for more on that, we're now joined by Robert Cohen. He's a professor of social studies education at New York University and NYU. Professor, you called this current wave of protests the biggest student movement of the 21st century in the US. What sparked this?
Concern about the escalation of the war in Gaza and the use of American military aid for for the war and all the deaths of civilians. I think, particularly with social media, students have found out about this very quickly, and they're very concerned about the use of American military aid for bombing and killing of civilians. You know, there's images of children that are dying, and I think that's the main reason why this burst out. And then the administration's responses initially to nonviolent protests clamping down and getting pressure from Congress and donors on administrations of colleges to shut these down. That, like the initial Columbia arrest before the building occupation, that was really helped to publicize this and to bring this further to the attention of students across the country. And this has been spreading across the country like wildfire.
Now, there are wars and injustices and civilian casualties in several places around the world. Some of these wars are being fought with US and other Western weapons, and some of them are long-lasting. Why is it that the current conflict in Gaza inspired such outrage among US students?
Well, I think it's because of the fact that so many civilians have been dying, and it's been very much out there in the news media and in social media. I think that feeling of, and by the way, also remember there was a sort of a smaller pro-Palestinian solidarity movement. The Students for Justice for Palestine has been on college campuses since the 1990s. It didn't really get much traction beyond a small group. What really really had it explode was this war and the civilian deaths. In a way, you could say, in a parallel way to the 60s, where Bull Connor, the racist police sheriff, when he attacked MLK and the anti-racist protest in Birmingham, with police dogs and fire hoses. I think Netanyahu is kind of that kind of figure in terms of people's public perception. And I think that the best organizer that these protests have had is Benjamin Netanyahu, inadvertently so, but that's nonetheless true.
Now, there also have been anti-Semitic undertones and expressions of solidarity with extremist organizations. Should that be worrying?
Oh, yeah, I think it's worrying, and I think people who engage in such bigoted behavior should be held accountable. But there has been a kind of an attempt to smear the entire movement. That is to say that all these protests are hateful and anti-Semitic, and that's just not true. I mean, here at NYU, the protesters who were arrested for nonviolently occupying a plaza in front of the business school, they had just had their Passover Seder when the arrests were happening. So to say that they're anti-Semitic and yet they have Jewish student activists and here they're having a Seder is a bit, it just doesn't add up. And that's not to deny that there has been a problem with anti-Semitism, but I think that's more of a kind of a fringe piece of this that needs, and again, any of those acts and slurs and slanders and certainly physical assaults, people should be held accountable and with due process punished if they're guilty of that. But I think the attempt of people in Congress and the donors to say these protests all have to be, even if they're nonviolent and non-disruptive, have to be suppressed, that's a kind of authoritarian response. And I think using the anti-Semitism issue in a way that's really not accurate, and it's just a way of sort of suppressing something that we don't like. And on a university campus where you're supposed to have the free exchange of ideas, that's a really bad model. And what in turn that's happened is, the Speaker of the House, I don't know if you recall this, went to Columbia University with a delegation of congressmen saying, congressional representatives saying the president of Columbia should resign, because as if she hadn't been tough enough. And so even though they arrested over 100 demonstrators. And so what you get here is a cycle of escalation. And that's how you got what I think was a really unwise and really tragic takeover of the administration building and damage university property. That wasn't happening initially. And I think the other thing I want to say, universities, one of the problems is they're not governed democratically. The universities may not and probably won't want to divest their holdings, their connections to Israel, but you could have a democratic process where even though on private university students are not on the board of trustees, they get to make their case, they get to be heard. Even if the trustees are going to say no, they at least get a hearing. And at Brown University, that method was used and the protest ended. In other words, the university didn't say we're the best. They just said, okay, do a presentation of it. We'll listen to you and we'll decide. So there is a way to de-escalate this. And unfortunately, that didn't happen at Columbia because you had, I think, a very inexperienced president who didn't really know how to handle these protests.
Well, let's take a look at the potential national significance of these protests. We're joined by David Farber, who's a professor of modern US history at the University of campus. Thank you so much for joining us on the day, Professor. Let's start with the comparisons being made between these protests and those against the Vietnam War back in the 60s. Do you think those comparisons are valid?
Well, there's certainly a degree of similarity, deja vu all over again. I think there's one major difference that I've been really struck by. You can think about the anti-war protests in the 1960s as being incremental went on for several years, started very peacefully, nonviolently, and then over several years' time escalated to more militancy. These protests have happened so fast, in such a compressed manner, and have moved from a kind of peaceful protest to some very militant actions in days, not years. So in that sense, I don't know if it's social media or just the rapidity of modern life, but there's a kind of urgency and quickness to these protests that's quite different than the long, incremental protests of students in the 1960s.
And what do you think today's students, universities, and indeed the federal government might learn from those 60s protests?
Yeah, that's a question that I've been thinking a lot about and been talking to a lot of people about. One thing that's pretty obvious is that if you, as a university administrator, move very quickly to bring police, or even worse case, to bring violent police actions against demonstrators, you tend to make a difficult situation worse. So administrators have to be very cautious about escalating matters because often there's a backlash. Students who were not interested or were disinterested suddenly become angry that their fellow students, their peers, are being treated in such a harsh way. So that's the lesson for administrators. Be careful, be cautious, don't do things you don't have to do for fear that you might escalate things worse. For students, I think the other issue is to be very mindful of what's their goals. I think this happened with the anti-war protests, certainly in the United States in the 1960s and early 70s, where students sometimes forgot that the point of the exercise was to convince others that U.S. policy was wrong, that there had to be changes in how the United States handled its international responsibilities. Here, too, I sometimes worry that students in their passions are forgetting their goal, which I gather would be to get their universities to divest from supporting Israel in any manner whatsoever, and perhaps even more importantly, to change the opinions of Americans and certainly American policymakers. So be considerate of what your tactics are and what your long-term goals are.
I was looking at a map of the campus protests today, and they do seem to have very much bypassed much of the middle of the country, including your own state of Kansas. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a couple fascinating reasons for it. One, typically, maybe this is true in Germany and other countries with disparate populations, the coasts tend to have more liberal orientations, more progressives live in those states. Those are the kids' parents or the students themselves. So blue states, we call them in the U.S., Democratic-leaning progressive states, California, New York, Massachusetts, et cetera, Washington State, Portland, Oregon. Maybe those are the natural first responders to this kind of trouble. Just before this interview, though, I went outside and saw that my own campus for the first time has a mass protest. And there's a kind of encampment growing. So it's several days later here in the state of Kansas, a traditionally conservative state. But here, too, it's happening. So we'll see whether this spreads or if the commencements that begin May 10th or 15th or so in most U.S. universities tends to dissipate students and the energy of these protests.
So what is it about this issue, do you think, Israel-Gaza, that seems to have lit a fire under students? Do you recall similar protests, for instance, about the two Gulf Wars?
Certainly not. Though do remember that there were eventually very large mass protests against U.S. intervention, in particular in Iraq. Millions of people, both in Europe and the United States, taking to the streets. But those were not campus-based. They were not university-based protests. Here, I think students are trying to understand, as was true way back in the Vietnam War era, are their own communities, are their own universities complicit in what many of these student protesters see as an ill-advised or immoral even policy toward Israel and Palestine? So here, in this particular struggle, there's a campus-based reasoning going on. And I don't think that was true with the Gulf Wars per se, or some of the other perhaps misadventures of U.S. foreign policy in recent years.
You mentioned the care needed when thinking about inviting police onto campus. Back in 1968, the Columbia president, Grayson Kirk, actually resigned a year after calling in 1,000 police officers to quell student protests against the Vietnam War, amongst other things. Do you think that the current Colombia president, Minouche Shafik, will end up stepping down?
Right now, I would say no. The scale of the protest, despite the international media attention to it, is relatively small in scale. And I don't think that the political environment is similar today. Obviously, most Americans still very much support Israel. They support the United States' position on supporting Israel. So I don't think that presidents of elite universities are fearing progressive impulses that would cause them to resign. It seems politically it's the other direction. We've recently had the presidents of Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania resign because of conservative pressure against them. So I think the political contexts are quite different in the United States today. We're in a more conservative place, maybe, than we were in 1968.
Fascinating analysis, and we thank you for it, Professor David Farber from Kansas University. Thank you.